Awesome. Great. So, hi, I am Sandra Korn. I'm an assistant editor in acquisitions at Duke University Press. I'm really excited to be here today with Katharina Galor, from a visiting associate professor at Brown University in Judaic Studies and Urban Studies, and with Saed Atshan, who's assistant professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Swarthmore College. Their co-authored book, The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians, which is here on the other side of my video, is just out now from Duke University Press. The Moral Triangle draws on Kati and Saed's ethnographic fieldwork and their interviews with Israelis, Germans, and Palestinians in Berlin to look at the relationships between those communities in the context of official German state policies, public discourse, and the private sphere, especially around the Holocaust, the Israel-Palestine conflict, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and Middle Eastern refugees entering Germany. So I'm really excited for our conversation today, happening here over Zoom. And I have a few questions prepared for the authors, so I will just start with a question for Kati. So you write in this book about the ways that Germany takes responsibility for commemorating the horrors of the Holocaust and has taken ownership over its own history of anti-Semitism and genocide. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it was like for you to speak to Germans who knew that their ancestors were complicit in this genocide?
Well, I can share with you two observations, one from my childhood and adolescence, during which I lived in Germany. And curiously enough, no one I met during the 19 years I lived in Germany seemed to know anyone who was even remotely connected to the Nazi regime. My family and many among our Jewish friends were survivors, and for them the Holocaust was very present. But for my German friends, classmates and neighbors, the Second World War was not something that seemed to be part of their lives and concerns. But in stark contrast to the situation in Germany during the 1970s and also early 1980s, when I returned to live in Berlin for a couple of years in 2016, and then also stayed there throughout our field study during the summer of 2018, I really discovered a completely transformed society with regard to the memories of the Holocaust. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is engaging and dealing with the dark past of National Socialism, is almost something that defines German society today, politically, socially, psychologically, culturally, intellectually, and even to some extent physically and visually, the urban landscape. It's really everywhere. And I was really taken by this change, mostly, of course, in a positive way, but sometimes also in disturbing ways.
And Saed, the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, took place in 1948 when 750,000 Palestinians were uprooted from their homes in the land that then became Israel. You talk about the Holocaust Nakba nexus in this book, the parallels that Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians draw between the two historical traumas. Can you talk a little, share a little bit about that, and how you write about the way that that nexus complicates who's a victim and who's a perpetrator? So I would love for you to just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandra, for that great question. And thank you so much for having us. It's an honor for me also to be back alongside Kati talking about our project and our book. And this is a very insightful question, because often there's a simplistic rendition of our argument that somehow we are arguing that the Holocaust equals the Nakba, or the Nakba equals the Holocaust. We are arguing that there's a nexus, but that nexus is very different than making the argument that somehow these two historical events are identical. They are not identical. We are not arguing that what we're seeing vis-a-vis the Palestinian condition is another Holocaust. That's not the argument that we're making. What we are making is an argument that these historical events are intimately interlinked, and that the Nakba actually wasn't an event that took place in 1948 and stopped, but that it's an ongoing process of displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people from historic Palestine. And we see that in the present with its reverberations, with the Trump administration supporting the Israeli government's attempts to annex parts of Israeli occupied West Bank. And so what we find is that the state of Israel derives much moral legitimacy in its creation from the events of the Holocaust in Europe. This is not to say that the only reason Israel became a state is because of the Holocaust. That would also be simplistic. But the Holocaust did play a critical and formative role in the establishment of the state of Israel. There's no denying that. And the Palestinian refugee experience, Palestinian suffering as a result of this process, which continues through the present, is directly or indirectly linked to those events in Europe as well. And so the traumas are overlapping. And as a result, the simple binary between victim and perpetrator often doesn't fit when a subject can simultaneously be both a victim and a perpetrator. This is an argument we advance in the book, and we draw upon Michael Rothberg's work, who's a Holocaust studies professor at UCLA, who argues for multi-directional memory, that instead of competing in terms of national suffering and who's suffering more, as scholars, we need to think much more along the lines of how it is that we can remember historical atrocities in the past and the present and connect those in a way that is inspired by a spirit of solidarity.
So Angela Merkel has famously made Germany welcoming to large numbers of refugees from Syria and other Middle Eastern countries. And many of those recent immigrants are themselves Palestinian, having fled Palestine after the Nakba to Syria or Lebanon. Could you talk a little bit about how those sort of recent refugees coming to Germany have been received and how the people that you interviewed understood and navigated that reception?
Well, there is a clear divide in German society. There's a real heartwarming, welcoming culture on the one side. Germans who will take refugees into their homes, who will volunteer to teach them, or who will donate money. And on the other side, we have this alarming increase of right-wing forces exemplified by the rise of power of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is a populist nationalist party who believe there should be no room for refugees and who are also very openly Islamophobic. Now, regarding Palestinians, some came to Berlin in 2015, along with all the other refugees, mostly from Syria, but they're really in the minority. For most Palestinians who live in Germany today, it was their parents, their grandparents, or their great-grandparents who fled first from Israel-Palestine to Lebanon, and then during the Civil War from there to Berlin. And their reception in Germany in the 1980s was really terrible, to put it mildly, in terms of housing, access to healthcare, to education, and the job market. And the hope for Germany at the time was that if they were completely marginalized and treated so badly, they would leave Germany, which of course didn't happen, as they really had no other alternatives. And so after a while, Germany recognized that not only did they punish Palestinians, but they created a real problem for German society. And so things slowly started to improve. Their legal situation started to change, and they also, they really started to be treated better. This said, Palestinians are still, at least for the most part, treated as second-class residents or citizens, even those who have achieved great success, financial and professional. First of all, because they're Middle Eastern origins. also because the majority are Muslims, not always considered a great asset in Germany either. And then there is this additional dimension. They're considered the enemy of Israel, and thus in the minds of most Germans, the enemy of Jews, and that's not in a good place to be in Germany today.
And who are the Israelis who have moved to Berlin in recent years? What is their experience of migrating like?
The Israeli community or communities in Berlin are actually a super fascinating group of folks. There are estimates that there are as few as 10,000, as many as 40,000 Israelis. The statistics are highly contentious, but at any time, there are always a significant number of Israelis living in Germany's capital city of Berlin, whether as visitors, as tourists, as short-term residents, as long-term residents, or people who go back and forth. Flights before the pandemic between Berlin and Tel Aviv were actually very common and very affordable. We found a huge wave of Israelis moving to Berlin, especially in 2011. Some moved before that, but that was really a significant turning point. Overwhelmingly, they tend to be young. Overwhelmingly, they tend to be left and progressive, although that is starting to change slowly but surely, especially with tech firms, etc. More conservative-leaning Israelis or right-wing Israelis are moving to Berlin in increasing numbers, but there are many artists, there are many intellectuals, and the German government really provides different forms of support in terms of resources, fellowships, visa support for residency, language training in German to facilitate the migration of Israelis to Berlin. This is hard for a lot of Israelis to accept. It's considered quite ironic that so many Jewish Israelis would be choosing Germany of all places as a place to go and to build new lives. But at the same time, a lot of Germans celebrate the fact that these Israelis are helping revive Jewish culture in contemporary Germany, given the history of the Holocaust. And what we found also was quite interesting. A number of our interlocutors, the Israeli interviewees, actually shared with us that they prefer to be treated normally. So they just want to be normal. So they don't want to be victims of anti-Semitism or hate crimes, etc. But at the same time, there was a sense that a lot of Germans, when they found out that they were speaking with an Israeli, would become very excited and very animated and tokenize them to some extent, fetishize them. And that kind of philo or philo-Semitism made a number of our Israeli interlocutors quite uncomfortable as well. So it is actually a really interesting group of people. And in our book, we really, through our ethnography, highlight a range of their voices and experiences.
So Kati, you kind of referenced this earlier, but I thought this phrase from your book, the politics of guilt, is so interesting. So the sense that like Germans, the sort of like sins of the past in Germany means that Germans have to support Israel at all costs, and how that has led to censorship and self-censorship for people in Germany who might have critical perspectives on Israel-Palestine or want to speak out in favor of Palestinian human rights. So what consequences does this politics of guilt have for the discussion of Israel-Palestine in Germany, and how did that play out when the two of you were together in Berlin?
Well, it was very clear that being an Israeli in Berlin puts you mostly in a place of privilege, legal, social, and also economic. Berliners, for the most part, love Israel and they love Israelis. They're really proud, as Syed already pointed out, that there is a revival of Jewish life in the city as long as these Israelis are not too critical of Israeli right-wing politics, which, however, they very often are, and that can be a problem. Since in the German discourse, if you're critical of Israel, you are an anti-Semite, it really creates a very awkward situation where many, if not the majority of these young, creative and intellectual Israelis are defined by Germans as anti-Semitic, even when most of those feel very committed to their Judaism. But there is, of course, a difference between an Israeli or a Jew who will criticize Israel and a German, or even worse, when a Palestinian will say something that is critical about Israeli right-wing politics. Being critical of Israel and Germany is really very different from voicing criticism of Israeli policies anywhere in the world, for obvious reasons. But I should say here that just yesterday, Germany took a very courageous step in showing solidarity with the Palestinian Authority, in taking an official stand against the planned annexation of parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. This was a really highly unusual initiative, and it will be very interesting to see how this will play out in the coming days or weeks or months.
So I don't know if people watching the video can see the image on the cover of the book, but it is a photograph of this performance artist, Robert Sneiderman, who's walking through the sort of like iconic Berlin Holocaust Memorial. And the back of his shirt says the word Gaza in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. So Saed and Katya, I would love for you to talk about the significance of this photograph, why you chose it for the cover of the book, and how the performance relates to your project.
Saed, go ahead.
Thank you. So we were so honored that we were able to discover Robert Sneiderman and his remarkable work, and also that he granted us permission to use this image of him as the cover for our book. He is an artist, and he produces different kinds of exhibits that he curates. He also engages in performance art. He identifies very much as Ashkenazi, as having Jewish European roots, and he also is very committed to social justice. And in this particular action and public display and artistic performance, he actually walked around the different parts of Berlin that are very symbolic to him, such as this Holocaust memorial site, carrying stones, as well as having a group of fellow artists and supporters of his who are Jewish or Palestinian or German, bearing witness to his actions. And in this particular site, you see his shirt, which, as you said, Sandra, has Gaza on the back of it, in Arabic, in English, and in Hebrew. And what he's doing is basically protesting, in a way, the way that his body as a Jewish person is being appropriated by certain right-wing actors to justify violence against Palestinians in the present. And so it's a way of honoring the past and commemorating the victims of the Holocaust in a very profound way, while also recognizing that suffering continues in the present and that our struggles are interconnected. It was such a powerful display that really gets to the heart of our book. And actually, last fall, Robert was a fellow, an artist in residence at Western Washington University in Washington State. And he invited us to give a lecture after one of his exhibitions, which Kati and I did, and we really enjoyed. And at that event, and it was a full auditorium, we actually unveiled the cover of the book, which had just been finalized and just been approved by Duke Press. Robert didn't know that we had gotten the official blessings to use the image or that the cover was ready. And we displayed it on the wide screen, and the room just erupted in thunderous applause. And he was deeply, deeply moved. So that for me was really one of the most profound experiences of this collaboration.
That was Duke Press designer Drew Sisk who worked on that, right? Who made the cover, my coworker Drew. Yeah, I think it's such a beautiful image for the cover. So I'm so glad that it's an amazing story about showing the artist his own work on the cover of a book. So sort of speaking about other artists that you talk about in the book, you write a lot about Yael Ronen, who's an Israeli theater director who is working in Berlin, and she puts Syrian and Palestinian actors on stage to speak about their experiences of migration and exile and acclimating to life in Germany. So what makes Yael Ronen's
and
work?
Israeli actors.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, what makes her work so compelling to you? What's the significance?
Well, it is simply fascinating to see that there is an artist who's thinking about all of the issues we've been thinking about with Saed, that are at really the very core of our research and all the things we engage in our book. Yael Ronen really managed to translate all these issues that are considered taboo in Israel and in Germany into a work of art through beautiful prose, movement, situations, colors, music, and just the fact that you can go and see play in the midst of Berlin where actors speak in their native Hebrew, Arabic, English, and German. The Gorky Theater, where Yael Ronen is an in-house director, is one of these numerous small pockets or bubbles in the city of Berlin where this is possible. And even if it doesn't reflect mainstream, it shows that there is hope. So we really loved her work and we're deeply touched by it.
So the two of you have given talks about your work and your collaboration across Germany and the US. How is your collaboration received in Germany when you've given talks about it there?
Well, I'll say that the first talk we gave together was at Humboldt University, and it went really well. But I remember at the end, as soon as we finished, all of a sudden everybody started knocking on the table in front of them, and I found this so unnerving. You know, all of these people knocking all at once. I'd never seen or experienced anything like that before. And at first, seeing a whole bunch of Germans all knocking on a table in unison in the first public lecture I've ever given, I turned to Kati like, what's going on? And then we found out that, or Kati knew this, but because she has a history there, but for me, it was one of my first experiences. So I learned that that's actually what they do. They don't clap at the end of a lecture. Everybody knocks on the table. So I found out that we were positively received, not negatively received. I think over the course of our talks, one of the things I've noticed is that people were comfortable privately coming up and sharing that they were sympathetic to our project, to our work, and that they were hesitant to share those points of view publicly. So there was much more of a willingness to express that support privately, but not publicly. And also I found that more and more young people were actually able to think more critically and in a more nuanced way. There was some more distance between them and the sort of atrocities that their grandparents or great-grandparents committed. So that was quite fascinating to see. Not all young Germans, but that for more young Germans, there's a willingness to, to be open. We also found that there were a few cases where there were individuals in Berlin who were not willing to be interviewed by us or to engage with us and our work. And for some of them, this is sort of on the far left, who felt that this was a form of normalization, that having an Israeli scholar and a Palestinian scholar collaborate on such a project was not something that they could get behind, because there's a concern that this in some way would mask asymmetries in power or oppression or occupation, when actually what we see is we're doing the exact opposite of that. This is a form of anti-normalization, it's a form of co-resistance in many, many ways. And we did encounter some anti-Semitism, which was painful for me to see Kati have to endure. We also encountered quite a bit of anti-Arab racism, and Kati would get even more worked up than me when we would encounter some of that. But I think that people found it really refreshing that we were able to do this and to pull it off. And we were touched by the overwhelmingly positive feedback that we received.
And you mentioned of the people, some people were not willing to be interviewed, and even you interviewed over 100 people, but most of their names don't appear in the book. I think you mentioned that only 6 of the people you interviewed were comfortable with their names being published. Can you talk about why that is so?
Yeah, I think talking about the Holocaust and talking about anti-Semitism is difficult enough, but bringing it into dialogue with the Nakba, with the Israel-Palestine conflict, with Islamophobia is really touching upon something that is very sensitive, very complicated in Germany, more so than in other places, mostly for Germans and Palestinians, but also to some extent for Israelis. And while the official public raison d'etat of Germany is the unconditional support of Israel, in private, as Syed already said, many felt that creating these political, human, social, and even human hierarchies is something that is very problematic. And so many of the details that the individuals we interviewed shared with us could, if stated openly and publicly, cause them to be not only marginalized, but even sometimes to lead to professional death sentence. So talking about these issues openly can be very, very problematic and even dangerous to some extent.
So to sort of like take a different tack and just move to wrapping up our conversation, I really loved this quote you both brought in from Michael Rothberg, the Holocaust studies scholar, and he calls for new transnational visions of justice and solidarity that do not reproduce the easily manipulated abstract code of good and evil. So what do those transnational visions of justice and solidarity look like for you today?
Yeah, so Rothberg's work, as I mentioned before, is a tremendous inspiration for us, and we were honored that he provided such a generous endorsement for the book, and we were glad to see that featured alongside Homi Bhabha's endorsement. And when we got that, he said that our book called The Moral Triangle, he said it exceeds its geometry. We were just over the moon that Homi Bhabha, one of the most renowned humanities scholars, would be so generous. And yeah, so this simple binary of good and evil is problematic. And we see that, for example, with Germans who want to be progressive and want to be enlightened and want to repudiate and disavow a German nationalist history of racism and violence, but then who think that that should translate in the contemporary context to support for the Israeli state, without realizing then that the Israeli state cannot be a placeholder for all things Jewish. The Israeli state cannot represent all Jewish people in Israel, let alone all Jewish people all around the world. And that actually by collapsing those categories in, frankly, such a reckless way, one ends up then supporting an ultra-nationalist, right-wing, violent, racist, oppressive regime in the present, all in the name of disavowing exactly those same dynamics. And so to move beyond this idea of good and evil, we have to see the heterogeneity of Jewish societies and perspectives, the heterogeneity of Israeli voices, the heterogeneity of Palestinian voices and experiences, the heterogeneity of German voices and experiences. And we really try to develop all these different schools of thought and showing the wide array of points of view in the German landscape on this question. But also Berlin, as Kati mentioned, gave us hope. And it allowed us to see what we call a post-Zionist context, a context in which Israelis and Palestinians have the potential to create spaces together where Israelis can be unabashedly Jewish, as Kati mentioned, and proud of their Jewish identities, proud of their Israeli identities, and speaking Hebrew and reading Hebrew newspapers and going to Israeli cafes, etc., where Palestinians can also practice their religion, whether they're Christian or Muslim, can speak their language of Arabic, can build cultural centers, but that there can be these points of intersection. We develop a whole chapter on points of intersection where Israelis and Palestinians can create art together, or interfaith dialogue together, or political collaborations. that are not under the weight of oppression, that are not under the weight of segregation, that really highlight the equality, the fundamental dignity that we all share. So even though there was so much that we critiqued, and we don't shy away from critique in our book, we also give Berlin the credit that it deserves and the credit that is due for providing a kind of model and vision for what a future could look like, that hopefully can even translate to the Israeli-Palestinian context in Israel-Palestine once the occupation ends and once freedom and equality is granted for all.
Thank you so much for that, Saad. So my last question is just about your writing process. So as an editor, one of the things I loved about working with you both on this project was your commitment to collaborative work. And you do that when you're speaking about your research on this moral triangle. The two of you always speak together, but also in the process of writing the book itself as co-authors. So could you talk a little bit about how you chose to work with each other on this project and how the process of co-authoring a book went?
Shall I start? Well, I would say for me it was really a life-changing experience, not only our book project, but also our friendship more generally speaking. We come from very different backgrounds, national, religious, lots of brainwashing, trying to define the other as the enemy. And we may have very different personalities, and we also have different working habits and styles, and of course also different scholarly backgrounds. But in terms of our intellectual approach and our understanding of the issues at hand, the issues that we examine in our book project, we really always agreed. And for me, the process of the research and writing process, and also our friendship is a sign that religious and national identities are really constructs and that differences can be bridged. And so I really hope we can create a model here of dialogue between people who come from conflict zones, not only in Israel, Palestine, but throughout the world. And so I'm really very grateful for this whole experience. It was wonderful for me.
That was really beautifully put, Kati. Thank you. And I also share that gratitude. I'll say that as an anthropologist, as a sociocultural anthropologist, so much of our production of scholarship is very individualistic. You know, you sort of claim a territory, you claim an ethnographic context, you engage in the research, you publish it in the form of an article or a series of articles or a book. It has your name all over it. And sociocultural anthropology, I think, could benefit much more from collaborative research. We see that in the STEM fields where having several authors is the norm. That's not the norm in my field. And so this experience with Kati was so overwhelmingly positive and demonstrated so clearly the importance of that collaborative research that it's really hard for me to see how I could go back to single author manuscripts in the future. I don't know how we could have written a book about the moral triangle between Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians without the other voice. Kati's German Israeli, I'm Palestinian, and in so many ways we embody that triangle so palpably just in producing the book. And I'll also say that I was incredibly inspired by Kati's conscientiousness, and also you're bringing your experience as an archaeologist, as a scholar of cultural heritage to the fore, because in our research, I saw how Kati was so eager to map out the whole city of Berlin, to not leave a single neighborhood untouched. We visited cafes and homes and parks, and we literally got a sense of the intimate landscape of the entire city and understood the density of Israelis and Palestinians and where they were found. So there was this eagerness to not leave a single living stone unturned. And that for me got me thinking, wow, archaeology, you know, it makes a lot of sense as a methodology, and it can be bridged with sociocultural anthropology. So that was great. And I also think that I didn't expect ultimately would be a book. I mean, initially we thought it would be an article, but then we just couldn't stop doing the research and the field work. We couldn't stop writing. It ended up becoming a book. And since then, we've actually now just completed a collaborative co-authored article on museum exhibitions of Jerusalem in 4 different locations. And that article will be coming out soon with the journal Conflict and Society. So I see this really as just the beginning, I hope. I can't speak for both of us.
And we're working on another book project together. We're now co-editing a book together on
gender in Israeli and Palestinian films. So I hope that this is only the beginning of even more collaboration.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kati and Saad, both so much for taking the time to talk about the moral triangle today with me in this experimental and exciting virtual book launch space. For those of you who are listening, Duke Press is having our 50% off spring sale until May 25th. So if you go to our website, dukeupress.edu, you can get the Moral Triangle plus any other book that's out currently from Duke Press for 50% off. So this is like the best time to get your hands on a copy of this book. But even after May 25th, it will be available from our website, dukeupress.edu. And Kati and Saad, I'll just close by saying it's been like such a joy to work with both of you and to read your writing. We're so proud to have brought this book out with Duke Press and to be launching it now.
Sandra, and if we can also thank you for being such a phenomenal editor and in many ways a doula, helping us give birth to this book, but really a brilliant editor, a wordsmith, and a great champion of our project from beginning to finish. And it's very special for us to culminate this experience in this interview. So we really want to extend our profound thanks to you.
And thank you for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you both for trying out this Zoom interview. So I guess we will sign off now. Have a great afternoon.
You too, take care. Bye-bye.